911, what are you reporting?
Gunshot that looks like a killing on 8th Avenue and 188th Street. A black Mustang pushed a guy out of a car and shot him about 3 times. The guy was slumped out of the car. He stopped at the intersection and I heard 3 more gunshots. And then he took off heading east on 188.
I was on my way to work when I got the call.
We got an unconscious elderly male with a apparent gunshot wound to the head.
It was an active scene, and I need to get to this intersection.
18200 block at Des Moines, or at the intersection 8th Avenue.
The shooting had just occurred, and the body had been dumped in the street.
The driver somehow got pushed out by somebody else, and then the black Mustang left. There's no pulse at all.
Sheriff's deputies aren't blocking off traffic and securing the crime scene. There was a pooling of blood. He was laying face down. The head wound in itself was a fatal shot. But the 3 wounds to the back was just insurance, so to speak.
A carjacker shot and killed 61-year-old Ron Whitehead. A witness saw Whitehead pushed out the driver's side door.
Ron Whitehead was 61. He worked at Boeing for approximately 42 years. He was a respectable man, a stand-up guy, and he cared for his family. It was a normal work day for Ron. He woke up, he did his typical morning routine, walked down into his garage, got into his black Mustang, and commuted to work. We thought that this was a random carjacking gone bad.
I got a phone call, and it was a police officer telling me something had happened to my dad. He had been shot, and that I needed to come to my dad's house right away. And I went and stood in front of the television, and I saw a person laying in the middle of the street. And I knew. Nobody wants to see that. My father, Ron Whitehead, married my mother in 1966. They had my brother and I. They divorced, and then he met and married Velma Ogden in the 90s. Velma had 2 children from the previous relationship, my stepsister Angela, and the other was John. My father considered both John and Angela to be his kids. He loved them, and he would do anything for them.
"17 hours later, that car still hasn't been found, and people, often complete strangers, are leaving flowers where he died."
There were news vans parked across the street. There was police there, just people everywhere. I couldn't cry. I couldn't be upset. I had to keep everybody else calm, and it wasn't until late that night that I found myself on the bathroom floor, physically sick, crying my eyes out. We were all hoping for some kind of information coming in, or tips or leads for the police to follow.
We decided to have a press conference with the media. I just hope that this person comes forward, turns himself in.
It was heart-wrenching to me, and it just made you think, how could this have happened to a family like this?
My stepmother, Velma, was crying, just crying and crying.
He bent down, he kissed me goodbye. He said, "I love you, and I'll talk to you later."
and he went out the door, and I waved to him out the window, and he never came home.
My stepdad, Ron, probably saved my mom. My mom's first marriage was very rough and very rocky. I would see and hear things that no child should ever have to hear. I don't even know how to put into words what she would have gone through.
My father was a very different man. My father was offering security, a place where Velma and her children would be safe.
He took us in, no questions asked. He raised us as his own kids.
Velma and Ron had been married for 10 years at the time that Ron was killed. Velma worked in an auto repair shop, also lived a pretty typical suburban life of going to her job and coming home.
Velma was a very gregarious person.
She could be a talker. That's probably where I get it from.
She could spend hours on the phone talking to me.
She was a very hands-on mom. She volunteered at our schools, in the school lunchroom. She was a playground teacher. It was the typical TV family. We had barbecues at the park in the summertime. We took trips to the ocean when we were little. I would say it was a loving all-American family.
There was a fear of the unknown that had really gripped the Seattle area. We had a violent carjacker on the loose, and would he or she do this again?
It's pretty scary. Could happen to anybody.
No one knew who this person was, where the car was. It was frightening.
It was extremely important to try to catch this person before anybody else was harmed and before any evidence was destroyed. And then we were able to locate the car abandoned in the parking lot of a healthcare facility.
Investigators are going over every inch of the car, hoping it will yield vital clues.
Police interviewed one of the staff members at the healthcare facility, and they recalled seeing the Mustang in the parking lot and an individual with a hoodie over his face who's about 5'7" or 5'8", walking away from the car.
King County detectives are still analyzing what they found inside, but it also hasn't led to a suspect, and the clock is ticking.
As time went on, with the killer still on the loose, the family was getting more and more desperate.
If they know who's responsible, if they've heard talk, even if it's just gossip, come forward.
The Whitehead family just wanted justice for Ron.
Nobody can hide forever.
They couldn't believe that all this time was going by and that somebody didn't know something. Well, somebody did know. Police discover Velma had been having an affair with a much younger man. Velma would want you to think that they had the perfect marriage. But as investigators dug a little deeper, that was not the picture that emerged.
The last year we've had problems. I felt like he was ignoring me a lot. He looked at porn on his computer all the time, and that bothered me, you know. I was jealous of his computer.
Through interviewing Velma's workmates, There was a strong suggestion that she was very close to one of the co-workers.
Velma was 47 years old. He was much younger than her, and she began a sexual relationship with him unbeknownst to Ron.
We were suspicious of Velma's lover. Did he have something to do with Ron's murder?
In the initial interviews of Velma after Ron's murder, she had denied any kind of extramarital relationship.
So police perked up and said, why would she lie about having this affair?
But we interviewed Velma's lover. He denied the affair. He also had a solid alibi for the day of Ron's murder, so we dismissed him as a suspect.
When police interview Velma in more detail, they learn that she and Ron were having financial troubles.
By all accounts, Velma was a spender.
Ron took her credit cards away. Velma was frustrated that she couldn't buy the things that she wanted to.
After Ron's death, Velma's money woes essentially evaporated. Velma wasted no time in collecting Ron's life insurance and other benefits.
She became a millionaire overnight.
There was something just off about Velma Ogden Whitehead. Something that you couldn't quite put your finger on. Her son, John, was 16. With his mother, it was an unusually close relationship. And maybe creepy on some levels.
Growing up, he got treated a little bit differently. Like he was made of glass.
John was just her special child, and she really locked on to him, and he got most of the attention.
Velma doted on John. One time that we went to dinner, when the food came out, he wasn't even allowed to cut his own meat on the plate. I just remember thinking, he's old enough to know how to do that. Velma was controlling situations that just didn't need to be controlled.
When my brother got to be a teenager, he fell in with the wrong crowd. There was some drug use, underage drinking, running around at night, probably doing things they shouldn't be doing.
Velma protected John and enabled him, let him do whatever he wanted to do.
Ron was more a traditionalist. He wanted to impart some discipline, and Velma just couldn't get away from coddling him. I think there was just a bond there that later on in this saga, Velma would come to depend on.
The evidence found at the scene, in addition to Ron's body, were 3 shell casings found on the ground where the car had been.
They belonged to a Makarov, which is a Russian-made semi-automatic handgun. And you don't find that brand every day.
Detectives did a background check on Ron. They learned that Ron had 2 Makarov pistols. Collectively, detectives were like, oh, this is huge. Now, we all thought he was killed with his own gun.
They asked Velma if my father had any guns in the house, and they wanted those turned over.
She hands them one of the Makarov handguns and the empty box to a second handgun. One of the Makarovs, owned by Ron Whitehead, was missing. Velma couldn't account for where the gun was.
Ron did not routinely carry this pistol, nor did he take it to work with him.
This missing Makarov is likely the murder weapon, and that really could only lead to one conclusion, and that's that the killer came from inside the house. This wasn't a carjacking at all. It was something much bigger.
The discovery that Ron was likely murdered by his own gun caused the police to refocus their attention on the Whitehead family.
We talked to Ron Whitehead's neighbors. One of his neighbors told us that his son and daughter had seen John Ogden a few days before the murder, running towards the playground with a gun.
A black handgun that possibly fit the description of the missing Makarov.
We decided to interview John. He initially lied, but then admitted he did have the Makarov pistol, but he denied any involvement in his stepfather's murder.
They described very specific type of guns that you have at your house and that we now have.
I was showing them the handguns, so I didn't know that.
Okay. Oh, so you did show them the hand. Okay.
Just said something about him, just food right there in my mind.
All right, so you did. All right.
He further added that he did not know what happened to the pistol.
John started to become a key suspect.
So we invited him for a polygraph to see if he was being deceitful or truthful to us about any involvement in Ron Whitehead's murder. I was expecting him to fail the polygraph test. I thought he was hiding something from us. He passed the polygraph test. He was removed from the list as a suspect in Ron Whitehead's murder.
At that point, any significant leads had dried up, and the case went cold.
We felt defeated that we could not solve this case. I knew that the anniversary was coming up again for Ron's murder.
Detective Doe made a point of contacting Velma and asking her to go to the media and make another plea for help.
My name is Velma Whitehead. We'd like permission to put up a Crime Stoppers flyer in your window.
Velma issued a challenge to the killer to not be a coward and just come forward.
Quit being a chicken and come forward. There's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide, and I don't care if it takes 50 years.
I thought those words were strange. Just the way that she put it. It just didn't seem natural. We went to the Whitehead home, and Velma invited us inside, and Kimberly and she and Angela sat on the couch. And I just thought to myself, something does not sit right.
We have to live with the fact that he's gone every day, but that person has to live with the fact that they murdered him every day. So who's worse off?
Outwardly, Velma was playing the grieving widow. But what was going on behind closed doors inside of that house was something different entirely.
I had already moved out, so I never lived with them. I did go and visit. John was at school and living in the house at the time.
I wasn't living at home at that time, but I noticed her behavior start to change.
After Ron's death, Velma had a windfall.
One of the first things Velma did was buy an all-new wardrobe for herself, change her hair, change the way she looked. She wore more makeup. Neighbors and friends noticed that she attempted to dress and look like someone much younger. Velma bought new furniture. She purchased a hot tub.
She bought gifts for her son. She bought gifts for her lover.
They went to Las Vegas on New Year's Eve.
She burned through his life insurance money. Velma saw herself as being able to be this glamorous woman of the world. Velma was no longer the married housewife to Ron Whitehead. She envisioned herself to be much younger and hip than the life she was allowed to live with Ron.
Their house became a party house.
My brother had his friends over all the time.
Velma would party with the young teenage men.
There were drugs there. There was all kinds of things going on.
It was always a mess. It looked like a frat house inside. I had heard rumors that she had some sort of physical relationship with one of my brother's friends.
Velma's new boyfriend was Jonathan's schoolmate.
He was nothing more than 17 or 18 years old.
She started to decorate the inside of the house in a very dark, gothic way.
Her boyfriend was a Dungeons and Dragons fan. So she had put wallpaper in her room to make it look like a dungeon.
In Velma's bedroom, there was a variety of sex toys, including dildos and also handcuffs.
My mom's 40-something years old, and this guy's not even 20. I was kind of grossed out by it when I heard it.
I just knew something was odd, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I need to reassess and review everything again.
We decided that the Mustang needed to be processed again.
The back seat of the car was pushed down, revealing an opening into the trunk. That struck police as unusual.
I remember distinctly opening the trunk, and our latent examiner says, "Hey, look at his palm print back here." There is a possibility that when they put their palm up there, they were bracing themselves to push down the back seat and crawl through to the passenger compartment of the car.
This solidified our theory that the murderer was hiding in the trunk. The only access to that trunk would have been someone from inside the house.
But this partial palm print doesn't belong to John or anyone in the Whitehead family.
We needed to know who that palm print belonged to.
Detective Doe began reviewing phone records involving family members of Ron Whitehead.
They notice a lot of activity going between John's phone and another phone.
Just hours before the murder of Ron Whitehead, 53 text messages were exchanged between Jonathan Ogden's cell phone and an unknown cell phone.
It turns out that that burner phone was John's old cell phone that had been reactivated just 2 days before the murder by his mother, Velma Whitehead.
We were becoming increasingly sure that John and Velma were both involved in this murder. Velma had activated a cell phone that had been used by someone to communicate with John Ogden.
We're now thinking it's not just 2 suspects, but probably 3.
Who had been communicating with John Ogden on the morning of Ron's murder? And was this also the person who had left a palm print that was found in the trunk of Ron Whitehead's Mustang?
We tracked the mystery cell phone to a 17-year-old student at Mount Rainier High School, which is the same high school that John attended.
That cell phone was found in the possession of another one of John's friends named Wilson Sayachuk.
We found that Wilson is no stranger to firearms and that he's a gang member in the Seattle area. We learned Wilson's currently in custody at the youth jail for a firearm violation.
I called our latent lab to compare Wilson's palm print to the one found in the Mustang.
At the same time that the pieces of the investigation were starting to fall into place, we also learned that Velma and John might be planning to actually pack up and leave the state.
This was urgent for us to act now.
We wanted to get confessions before they left town.
I had to make a push. There were 3 teams in operation, over 30 detectives. I was betting heavily on it.
Velma and John were brought to the police station and taken into separate interview rooms. At the same time, Wilson Sayachuk was being interviewed in the juvenile facility where he was being held.
Wilson Sayachuk caught me off guard. I knew he was 17 years old, but he was not intimidated at all by the police asking him questions.
Trying to put me on a murder rap right now?
Do you have any part of Jonathan's dad's death?
My freaking answer is, whoever said that,
Wilson did admit that John Ogden had provided him with a cell phone that he could use.
I interviewed Velma with the information that Wilson had provided me.
Velma knew police were closing in.
Velma's interview incriminated John and Wilson.
I know that somehow my son is involved in this, but I don't know how, and I don't know how deep.
As the interviews went on, she begins to admit she may have been aware of a plan to rob Ron.
Wilson said that if the car is carjacked, you get more money for it, and the insurance company pays off sooner. That's the only thing I gave them permission for.
Okay,
in the beginning. To steal the car.
She said that she just wanted Ron roughed up. She never dreamed that he'd actually be killed.
They were not supposed to hurt him in any way. I told John, no guns, no violence. I thought John was listening to me. I thought he had enough respect for me that he would listen.
Velma gave up her own son to try to save herself.
Our next step was to re-interview Jonathan Ogden.
He asked why we were talking to him again because he had passed the polygraph. He had passed it. Why should we be talking to him? John started getting nervous, and he started to talk.
I know that my mother was frustrated with him, very frustrated. She didn't want to get divorced. She wanted him to be out of her life, maybe get robbed or something. So I said, okay, well, I know somebody.
She manipulated John's emotions to make him want to help his mother by finding somebody who could get rid of Ron. She also frightened him into believing that if she divorced Ron, they would be on the streets with no house and no money.
Velma planted that seed within Jonathan. It grew, and Jonathan decided to act on it and make it happen.
I told my mom that this guy Wilson will probably do what you want, but I didn't know it was going to be a murder.
About this time, the latent print came back with a positive identification to Wilson. That was his right palm print in the trunk of the Ford Mustang.
Wilson Sayachek had been the one hiding in the car and killed Ron.
Wilson realizes that it's time for him to come clean.
I was in it for a quick money, man. I need money. Okay. You want me to tell you what really, really happened?
John called Wilson and told him this was the night it was going to happen. And Wilson came over to the Whitehead house.
The two of them were playing on the computer until they heard Ron waking up. Wilson and John went down to the garage.
John gives Wilson Ron's Makarov handgun. Velma actually comes into the garage and hands Wilson a pair of gloves, which he doesn't put on. Wilson Sayachek climbed into the trunk of the black Mustang, armed with the Makarov.
The last text before Ron left the house was John saying, "He's coming down, get ready." Ron got ready for work as usual, got into his Ford Mustang, left the garage. Velma was waving him goodbye from their front window.
They've gone a couple miles and come to a stop at an intersection.
Wilson pushed the back seat forward, climbed into the back seats. Wilson took his hand and he put it to the back of my head, told me this is where I shot him.
As the car began to drift forward, Wilson moved into the front, shoved Ron's body out of the car.
He leans over and fires 3 shots into Ron's back to finish him off. And then the car speeds away.
Ron lay dying on the ground. 5:44 a.m., there was a very short phone call from Wilson's phone telling John that he had shot Ron.
I was like, it's done and shit. I dropped the car off and everything. They're like, okay, Wilson, yeah, later on I'll get you your money.
What did they promise you for money?
Promise me $1,000.
It was Velma's plan from the start. Ron lost his life for $1,000. $1,000 still. Velma was formally arrested and taken to the King County Jail.
In a shocking twist, detectives arrested Velma for the murder of her husband, Ron. And investigators say Velma's 18-year-old son, John, and John's 17-year-old friend helped carry out the plot.
I had no idea that the entire time we are talking to the media, pleading for someone to come forward and turn themselves in, the person was standing there right next to me the entire time.
It was blindsiding. It was completely blindsiding. My jaw hit the floor. I couldn't connect the dots. I didn't see it. I couldn't understand how either one of them would have had anything to do with it.
There was no physical evidence left behind that could tie Velma to Ron's murder. We offered Velma a plea to murder in the first degree without the additional 60 months for the firearm, and she took that offer.
How do you plead to murder in the first degree, guilty or not guilty?
I plead guilty, Your Honor.
And then suddenly Velma shocks everyone.
In the court proceedings, Velma attempted to say that she is involved in an abusive relationship with Ron.
Physical beatings, verbal abuse. Velma tried to paint Ron as a monster and herself as desperate to get away from him, and that this plot to kill him was her form of self-defense.
Ron Whitehead's family fired back, saying she killed her husband and now she was killing his reputation.
No one in my family has ever heard or witnessed any abuse by my father. He cannot be here in this court to defend himself from her despicable and disgusting lies.
It was her again, trying to save herself from whatever punishment that's coming towards her.
Knowing that I will never be forgiven by him is something that I have to live with for the rest of my life. And that's a much harsher punishment than anything the court could ever hand down to me.
The judge called those crocodile tears and tacked on 2 years to her plea deal.
You have shown yourself to be selfish and duplicitous. I see nothing that merits mercy.
I believe the sentence that my mom got was fair. Even if it's not what she meant to happen, it still happened. Did she make a bad choice? Yes. Did she go about things the wrong way? Absolutely. Do I condone what she did? No. People do crazy things when they want love or want attention.
The final event that really drove Wilson to plead guilty to murder was that the prosecutor's office listened to his jail conversation between him and his mom.
And she's telling him, you need to tell the truth. Did you do this? Yes. Yes, ma'am, I did.
So he was confessing to his mother that he had killed Ron Whitehead.
In the end, he wasn't willing to lie to his mother. And that sealed Wilson Sayachek's fate. So here you have Wilson's mother telling him to do the right thing and getting the truth out of him. And Velma Whitehead actually involving her son in this terrible crime.
My brother chose not to take a plea deal. He was convinced that he could go through trial and be found not guilty. He sat at the table, pretty much staring at his hands the entire time. He didn't make eye contact with me. He didn't even want to look at me.
We, the jury, find the defendant Jonathan and Jeffrey Ogden guilty of the crime of murder.
John was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Just as she took Ron's life, she took her son's life too.
Grooming your son into murdering your husband is probably one of the biggest betrayals you could do as a parent.
The mother sucking her son into her marital problems, into her unhappiness.
This one is a picture of me and my dad. This was very special to me. At my dad's funeral, there were so many people that came, and they all had wonderful stories about how much he meant to them, how much he's going to be missed by them. I'll never forget that.
We were able to achieve justice for Ron, who was just a hardworking, normal guy going about his day, having no idea that he was going to be brutally murdered by people that he trusted and loved. The only regret I have is that the true mastermind behind the plan didn't get as much time in prison as the two young men who she convinced to carry out this murder. There's probably a special place in hell for Velma Ogden Whitehead for what she did.
She looked like Elizabeth Taylor. Kenny was a golden child. And then the flip side.
His mother said, kill him.
Times were on the run. Mother and son stayed in that one room. It's kind of weird.
Whatever she wanted, he would do. Mom hired someone to kill him.
She was the most evil woman.
It starts with a silence that never made sense. A desert road outside Flagstaff, Arizona, August 1992. No witnesses, no screams, no broken glass. Just a car pulled halfway onto the shoulder, engine cold, driver's door open, and the kind of quiet that feels staged, almost deliberate, as if someone pressed pause on a life and walked away. Police would later call it a cold case, but that night it was anything but cold. It was fresh. It was raw. It was a shock that moved faster than the wind across the red dust. By sunrise, the name was already spreading through town. Whispered in kitchens, muttered at gas stations, spoken carefully in front of children. A local woman, 36 years old, a mother, a sister, someone who did not vanish, someone who was taken out of the frame. Her purse was still on the passenger seat. Her keys were still in the ignition. Her wedding ring lay on the console, placed neatly, not dropped. That detail would haunt detectives for decades. Because people who leave willingly do not leave rings behind like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. The headlines the next morning were sharp and urgent. Arizona woman missing under suspicious circumstances. Family pleads for answers. Search intensifies in Coconino County. Helicopters cut across the sky. Volunteers lined the desert trails. Dogs traced her scent to the edge of the asphalt, and then nothing. The trail didn't fade. It stopped, abruptly, as if the ground itself refused to cooperate. Inside the home, nothing appeared disturbed. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. The answering machine blinked with routine messages. Bills lay unopened on the counter. A half-finished cup of coffee sat near the sink. The surface filmed over, untouched since morning. The television was off. The house felt paused in mid-breath. Investigators started where they always do. Last phone calls, last sightings, last known movements. She had told her sister she'd be home by dusk. She never arrived. She had no history of disappearing. No packed bags. No withdrawn cash. No note. No warning. And then there was the family. From the outside, they were solid. Church on Sundays. Barbecues on holidays. The kind of family neighbors described with safe words. Quiet, respectable, normal. But detectives know that normal is often a surface, not a depth. And beneath the surface, fractures wait. The husband spoke calmly. Too calmly, some thought. He cooperated. He answered questions. He never raised his voice. He said all the right things. He said he loved her. He said he couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. He said he hoped she would come home soon. But hope has a sound. And what investigators heard wasn't hope. It was control. Friends mentioned arguments. Not violent ones. Not dramatic ones. The kind that leave no bruises but reshape a room. Tension about money. Tension about family obligations. Tension about something no one could quite name. The word secret hovered. Unspoken. Like heat above the road. Search teams expanded outward. Desert washes. Abandoned mine shafts. Remote pull-offs known only to locals. Every place where the land could swallow a body and never give it back. They found nothing. Not a shoe. Not a scrap of fabric. Not a trace of blood. Weeks passed. Then months. The headlines shrank. The public moved on. The case file grew thicker but colder. Leads dried up. Tips contradicted each other. Sightings came in from Phoenix, from Nevada, from California, all false. All hopeful lies or mistaken ghosts. By 1994, the investigation stalled. By 1997, it was officially labeled a cold case. But cold cases are not dead. They are preserved. Waiting. Years later, detectives would return to one detail that never fit. The ring. Placed, not lost. A gesture. A message. Either from the victim or for her. Family dynamics shifted after the disappearance. Relationships fractured. Some members stopped speaking entirely. Others closed ranks, refusing interviews, refusing anniversaries, refusing memory itself. Grief hardened into something less visible, more dangerous. Silence. Children grew up with unanswered questions. Parents aged without closure. The desert remained unchanged, indifferent, holding its breath. Then, 3 decades later, something broke. Not in the soil, not in the files, inside the family. A conversation overheard. A deathbed confession hinted at, then denied. A document uncovered where it should never have been. Words like accident, promise, that night surfacing after years of suppression. Detectives who had long since retired received calls they never expected to hear. Names resurfaced. Alibis were questioned again. The headline would eventually read, Arizona 1992 cold case solved. Family secret explodes after 30 years. But solved is a dangerous word. Because what came out did not restore a body to the desert, did not rewind time, did not erase the silence of that road at dusk. It only confirmed what many had feared, that the truth was never far away. It had been sitting at family tables, passing dishes, avoiding eye contact, waiting for time to make it safe. And even now, with answers claimed and secrets exposed, the question still lingers in Arizona's dry air. Not who knew, but how many chose not to speak. The desert remembers. Cold cases remember. And some silences, once broken, echo forever. Time does not heal a crime like this. It rearranges it. It moves the pain into corners, pushes the questions into drawers, teaches people how to live around the absence instead of through it. By the late 90s, the woman's name was no longer spoken out loud in Flagstaff unless necessary. New families moved in. Old neighbors learned not to ask. The desert road where her car had been found was repaved, widened, stripped of its original scars, but locals still slowed down when they passed it, still glanced to the side as if something might suddenly reappear, standing exactly where it had vanished. Inside the police department, the case lived on in a metal cabinet, 3rd floor, West Wing, a folder thick with reports, maps, photographs, and margins filled with handwriting from detectives who no longer wore badges. The cold case unit reviewed it every few years, usually after receiving a tip that promised everything and delivered nothing. Psychic letters, anonymous calls, confessions that collapsed under basic scrutiny. Each time the same ending. No body, no crime scene, no charge. But the case refused to die quietly, because families do not freeze in time the way evidence does. They change, they fracture, they age. And with age comes slippage. Memory weakens. Loyalties soften. Fear loses its edge. A secret that once felt necessary begins to feel heavy, then unbearable. The husband remarried, moved 2 counties away, built a life that looked stable enough from the outside. He avoided interviews. When pressed, he repeated the same lines he had rehearsed decades earlier, word for word, as if consistency itself could substitute for truth. Detectives noted it. They always do. Stories that never change are often the most rehearsed. The sister stayed. She became the unofficial keeper of memory. Every anniversary, she placed flowers near the roadside marker erected years after the search had ended. She spoke to reporters when no one else would. She said the case was not over. She said someone knew something. She said silence was not innocence. And then there were the children. They grew up learning how to answer questions without answers. Learning how to say, she disappeared, instead of, she was taken. Learning how to live with a photograph frozen in time, a face that never aged while theirs did. Psychologists call it ambiguous loss. Grief without a body, mourning without proof. It leaves a wound that never closes because it never fully opens. One of them would later tell investigators that home never felt safe again. Not because of violence, because of tension, because of things not said, because of arguments that stopped when they entered the room, because adults spoke in fragments, glances, pauses. The first Real crack appeared in 2009. A routine audit of old evidence brought the file back into circulation. New detectives, unburdened by old assumptions, read it with fresh eyes. They noticed patterns others had dismissed, timelines that didn't quite align, phone records that suggested conversations longer than reported. A neighbor's statement, buried on page 147, describing raised voices on the night of the disappearance. Not screaming, but intense, controlled, angry. Controlled anger leaves no noise complaints. They reopened interviews, carefully, quietly, no press, no announcements, just conversations. The husband declined, said he'd already given everything he had to give. His lawyer confirmed it. The law, once again, stood between suspicion and proof. Then, in 2016, a death changed the temperature of the case. An older family member passed away after a brief illness. In the days that followed, the house was cleared. Drawers opened that had not been touched in years. Boxes labeled taxes and old papers were sorted without much attention, until someone found an envelope where it did not belong. Inside were copies of documents no one remembered making. A handwritten note, not a confession, not a map, just a sentence, incomplete, vague, and devastating in its restraint. A reference to that night and what we agreed to do for the family. No names, no dates, but enough to send a chill through anyone who read it. The envelope made its way anonymously to the police. When detectives saw it, they felt the shift immediately. This was not a tip from outside. This was internal. This was family language. The kind of shorthand only shared by people who believe they are protected by blood. They re-interviewed everyone. This time, the questions were sharper, focused, less about what happened, more about what didn't. Why certain calls were never mentioned. Why specific hours were glossed over. Why grief had taken the shape it did, restrained, controlled, almost managerial. One relative broke down. Not fully. Not enough to hand over the truth, but enough to confirm what investigators had long suspected. The disappearance was not random. It was not the work of a stranger. It was domestic, contained, managed. But still, there was no body. Without a body, prosecutors hesitate. Juries doubt. Defense attorneys thrive. The desert offers too many alternative explanations. Accidents, wildlife, exposure. Minds that go down deeper than maps admit. Reasonable doubt grows easily in a place built on emptiness. Years passed again. The case hovered in a strange limbo. Not cold, not active, just waiting for the final thread to loosen. That thread came from an unexpected place. A family argument. Loud, emotional. Years of resentment surfacing all at once. Someone said too much. A name, a location. A phrase that could not be unsaid. Another relative, shaken, contacted authorities, not out of loyalty, but exhaustion. Detectives listened. This time they recorded everything. The story that emerged was not cinematic. No masked stranger. No dramatic confrontation under moonlight. Just a domestic moment that spiraled. An argument that went too far. A push, a fall, panic. Decisions made quickly, justified as protection, rationalized as necessary. A family choosing unity over truth. The desert became a solution. Investigators searched again. Not randomly, precisely, based on decades-old directions passed down like an inheritance. They found disturbed soil, not remains, evidence of digging, evidence of something once there, now moved. Time had erased what it could. People had finished the rest. When the press finally caught wind, the headlines exploded. Arizona 1992 cold case reopened. Family secret under investigation. New evidence emerges after 30 years. Solved was the word everyone wanted. But closure refused to cooperate. Because some crimes do not end with arrests. They end with understanding, partial, damaged, incomplete. They end with a truth that arrives too late to heal, too early to forget. As the case moved toward its public reckoning, one thing became clear. The disappearance was not just a crime. It was a choice repeated every day for 30 years. A choice to stay silent. A choice to protect. A choice to let a community search a desert for answers that were sitting at family dinners, unspoken. And as Arizona prepared to hear what had been hidden for decades, the question was no longer what happened that night. It was how many nights followed where the truth could have come out, and didn't. Once silence cracks, it doesn't shatter cleanly. It splinters. It spreads. It turns every remembered moment into a suspect and every family story into a crime scene. After the second reopening, detectives began to understand that this case was not buried in the desert alone. It was buried in routines, in habits, in the way people learned to speak around the truth without ever touching it. They reconstructed the day again. Not the version repeated for 30 years, but the one hiding underneath it. The morning began like any other Arizona summer morning. Dry heat already settling into the bones before noon. The victim had made calls that never appeared in early reports. Short ones. Controlled. No panic. The kind of calls made when someone is trying to keep a situation contained. One call in particular lasted longer than remembered. Long enough for voices to rise. Long enough for a decision to form. Neighbors remembered now what they hadn't then, or what they hadn't allowed themselves to remember. A car idling longer than usual in the driveway. A door slammed, not violently, but decisively. A pause. The sound of an engine pulling away too fast. Tires briefly losing grip on gravel. At the time, it meant nothing. After decades of silence, it meant everything. Investigators mapped movements minute by minute. Not just hers, but everyone's. Who was home. Who left town unexpectedly. Who made phone calls they couldn't explain. Patterns emerged that no longer looked coincidental. They looked coordinated. The family narrative began to unravel under pressure. Small contradictions surfaced, not lies exactly, but edits. Words removed. Emotions minimized. Details smoothed over until the story felt safe enough to live with. When detectives confronted relatives with earlier statements, the room changed. Shoulders tightened. Breathing shifted. People stopped making eye contact. One relative asked a question that changed the tone of the interview entirely. What happens if we tell you everything and nothing changes? It wasn't defiance. It was fear. Fear that truth, once spoken, would not bring justice, only destruction. Families are not built to survive full honesty after that kind of betrayal. Detectives heard it before. They hear it in cold cases where the enemy is not a stranger, but history. The desert searches resumed quietly. No helicopters this time. No volunteers. Just professionals with ground-penetrating radar and coordinates that had been whispered, not written. They scanned areas previously cleared, now reconsidered with context. The land told its own story. Subtle depressions, unnatural lines, soil that had been disturbed and then carefully restored. Someone had known what they were doing. Someone had time. Still, no body surfaced. And without it, the case hovered in legal purgatory. Prosecutors reviewed evidence cautiously. Cold cases do not get second chances easily. Memories degrade. Witnesses die. Defense strategies grow stronger with age. The question was not whether something happened. It was whether it could be proven beyond doubt. Meanwhile, the community felt the tremor. Reporters returned. Old photographs resurfaced. Her face appeared on screens again. Unchanged, eternal, staring out from the past. People who had been children in 1992 now spoke as adults, recalling how their parents lowered their voices when her name came up. How fear had seeped into daily life, subtle but persistent. If someone could vanish like that, in daylight without a trace, then safety itself was fragile. The husband, now older, watched the headlines from a distance. He issued a brief statement through his attorney. He denied wrongdoing. He expressed sympathy. He asked for privacy. The words felt familiar, almost archival. Detectives noticed what he did not say. He did not say he wanted answers. He did not say he hoped the truth would come out. Behind closed doors, the pressure inside the family intensified. Conversations turned accusatory. Old alliances collapsed. Someone accused someone else of starting it. Another claimed they were cleaning up a mess they never made. Responsibility fractured, passed around like a burden no one wanted to carry alone. One relative finally spoke in detail. Not publicly, not yet, but enough. They described a moment of chaos, an argument fueled by years of resentment, a push that wasn't meant to kill, a fall that changed everything, panic flooding the room, the realization that calling for help would expose more than just an accident. It would expose a history, affairs, financial secrets, threats of leaving, things that could not survive daylight. What followed was not a single decision, but a series of them, each one smaller than the last, each one easier to justify. Move the car, stage the scene, choose a location the desert would protect. Tell the children as little as possible. Tell the police just enough. Agree silently to never speak of it again. Silence became policy. For years it worked. The cold case designation acted like a seal. Time did the rest. People assumed the worst had already happened. The desert was blamed. Fate was blamed. Everyone slept easier believing it was unknowable. Until it wasn't. As investigators prepared their findings, they faced a brutal reality. The truth they had uncovered was incomplete, fragmented, strong enough to shake a family, but maybe not enough to survive a courtroom. Justice, in its formal sense, might never arrive. They briefed prosecutors anyway. The phrase "solved" entered the conversation cautiously, not as a legal conclusion but as a narrative one. The story at last made sense. The pieces fit. The silence had an origin. When the press finally published the headline, it landed like a detonation. Arizona 1992 cold case solved. Family secret explodes after 30 years. Phones rang across the state. People argued over what solved meant. Some demanded arrests. Others demanded compassion. Many felt only exhaustion. There was relief, yes, but also anger. Because knowing that the truth had been close all along felt like a second betrayal. The sister read the article alone. She had waited decades for answers. What she got was confirmation of her worst fear, that the danger had never been outside the home, that the desert had only been an accomplice, not the culprit. She visited the roadside marker again. The flowers wilted quickly in the heat. She stayed anyway. Closure, she realized, was not a moment. It was a process, and this was only the beginning. As legal teams debated next steps and investigators weighed what could still be proven, one thing became clear. The case had changed shape. It was no longer about disappearance. It was about silence, about how many people can live with the truth when speaking it costs everything. And in Arizona, as the sun sank behind the red horizon, the desert remained unmoved, holding whatever fragments it had been given, indifferent to headlines, patient as ever, waiting to see whether truth, once exposed, would finally be allowed to stay. Truth, once exposed, does not arrive clean. It drags debris with it, old resentments, half-memories, fear that has learned how to survive. After the headline broke, investigators were no longer chasing whispers, they were managing fallout. Phones inside the department rang nonstop. Some callers wanted justice. Others wanted the story buried again. A few wanted to confess to nothing more than knowing too much for too long. The case file grew heavier, not with new evidence but with context. Motives sharpened. Relationships clarified. The shape of that night in 1992 became clearer, even as the physical proof remained stubbornly absent. Detectives understood now that the disappearance was not an isolated act. It was the final moment in a long sequence of pressure, control, and quiet threat that had been normalized over years. They examined finances again. Old bank statements, property records, insurance policies quietly adjusted months before the disappearance. Nothing illegal on its face. But together, they told a story of preparation, of a life narrowing, of options closing. People don't always plan murder. Sometimes they plan inevitability. Witnesses who once dismissed their own observations began to reconsider them. A coworker recalled a conversation that had felt strange at the time. The victim mentioning she might need help, then laughing it off. A friend remembered her asking about desert roads, about places no one ever goes. At the time, it sounded like curiosity. Now it sounded like fear rehearsed as casual talk. The family lawyer pushed back hard. Statements were crafted. Language was controlled. Unsubstantiated claims. Grief-driven speculation. No physical evidence. Every phrase was designed to cool the narrative, to return the case to its cold, inactive state. But something fundamental had shifted. Silence was no longer neutral. It was suspicious. Behind closed doors, prosecutors argued. Some believed the case could still be brought. Circumstantial evidence, corroborated statements, a coherent timeline. Others warned of disaster. No body, no weapon, no definitive crime scene. The desert had done its work too well. A failed prosecution would not bring justice. It would entrench denial forever. The family continued to unravel. Conversations once protected by shared secrecy turned hostile. People accused each other of leaking, of misremembering, of rewriting history to save themselves. One relative claimed they had been lied to from the beginning. Another admitted they had suspected the truth for years but lacked the courage to confront it. Loyalty became a weapon. Memory became a battleground. One interview stood out. A middle-aged relative, hands shaking, voice controlled with visible effort. They described how the decision had been framed back then, not as a crime but as containment. An accident that could not survive exposure. A problem that would destroy everyone if handled the wrong way. The desert, they were told, was merciful. It erased mistakes, kept secrets. It had done so before. That logic, once accepted, became unchallengeable. Each year of silence made the next easier. Each birthday passed without answers became proof that the lie was working. The family did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as survivors of a terrible moment, bound together by necessity. Investigators heard it all without interruption. They had learned long ago that justification often sounds like confession, just delivered sideways. Public reaction hardened. Some in the community defended the family. They argued that accidents happen, that panic is human, that destroying a family decades later served no one. Others were unforgiving. They saw the silence as cruelty layered on cruelty, not just to the victim, but to her children, her sister, an entire town taught to fear the unknown instead of confronting the familiar. The desert searches officially ended again. There was nothing left to dig without destroying the land itself. Whatever physical proof had once existed was gone, scattered, consumed, or relocated beyond recovery. Time had finished the job, and yet the case refused to settle. Cold cases rarely end with answers. They end with acceptance. This one hovered uncomfortably between the two. Solved in narrative, unsolved in court. The worst possible balance. The sister was invited to a private briefing. No cameras, no reporters, just a room, a table, and the truth as investigators understood it. They spoke carefully. They avoided speculation. They told her what they could prove and what they could not. They told her who knew. They told her when the silence began. She listened without interruption. When they finished, she did not cry. She nodded, slowly, as if something heavy had finally landed where it belonged. She asked only one question. Did she suffer? No one answered immediately, because some questions are not meant to be answered with certainty, only with honesty. Outside, the desert wind moved across the pavement where the car had once stood. Traffic passed. People lived their lives. But the case had changed them all. It had revealed something uncomfortable and enduring, that the most terrifying mysteries are not those that vanish into wilderness, but those that live for decades inside homes, protected by routine, disguised as normal. As legal deadlines approached and options narrowed, investigators prepared for the final act of their involvement. Reports were finalized, statements archived, recommendations submitted. The case would not move forward in the way many hoped. There would be no handcuffs, no courtroom spectacle, no moment where a gavel restored balance. Instead, there would be knowledge. and knowledge once released cannot be taken back. For the family, the explosion had already happened. For the community, the shock was still unfolding. And for the victim, whose name had become a headline, a cold case, a cautionary tale, there was only the quiet certainty that her disappearance had never been random. It had been chosen. And as Arizona settled into another night, the desert did what it always had. It watched, it waited, and it kept the rest. After the truth surfaces, something else follows close behind: revision. People begin to re-edit their own memories, trimming away what no longer fits, amplifying what now seems obvious. In Flagstaff, conversations shifted. Stories once told casually became evidence. Silence, once explained as grief, was reconsidered as strategy. The past rearranged itself in real time. Detectives noticed it immediately. Old witnesses called back, suddenly certain of details they had once been unsure of. The human mind, when given a narrative, rushes to complete it. Investigators listened, but they filtered carefully. Memory, especially delayed memory, is a dangerous accomplice. Still, patterns persisted. The same names, the same hours, the same gaps. The cold case unit drafted its final internal assessment. It did not read like a victory. It read like an autopsy of silence. Page after page described not just what happened, but how it was allowed to remain hidden. The report avoided dramatic language. It didn't need it. The facts, when aligned, carried their own weight. At the center was the moment no one could unsee anymore: the decision. Not the push, not the fall, the choice afterward. The moment when calling for help was considered and rejected. When survival of the family eclipsed the life already lost. That was where the crime truly began. Legal experts weighed in quietly. Statutes of limitation, evidentiary thresholds, the brutal mechanics of prosecution. Even if charges were filed, the likelihood of conviction was uncertain. Decades-old testimony collapses under cross-examination. Motive, once clear, blurs. Reasonable doubt grows teeth. The family understood this. Some took comfort in it. Others found no relief at all. One relative stopped sleeping. Another began drinking again after years sober. A third moved away abruptly, selling their house below market value, unwilling to live where every street corner now felt like an accusation. Secrets don't dissolve when exposed. They migrate. They lodge themselves in new places. The husband remained mostly silent. His attorney handled inquiries. He did not attend community meetings. He did not appear at memorials. His absence spoke louder than any denial. To some, it was proof. To others, it was just another man refusing to relive a nightmare. Truth without a courtroom is subjective. The children, now adults, reacted differently. One demanded accountability. Another withdrew completely, unwilling to engage with a narrative that reframed their entire childhood. The third asked investigators for details they could not ethically provide. There are limits to truth-sharing, even when the truth is already out. Cold cases do not just reopen investigations. They reopen identities. Psychologists call it secondary trauma, the pain of discovering that the foundation you built your life on was compromised. Birthdays, holidays, family photos, all contaminated by hindsight. Every smile re-examined. Every absence reinterpreted. The community held a vigil. Candles flickered against the dark, fragile against the desert night. There were no speeches, just names read aloud, including hers. When her name echoed through the crowd, something shifted. For the first time in decades, she was not just missing. She was acknowledged as gone. Some cried. Others stood rigid, arms crossed, staring into the distance. A few left early, unable to reconcile empathy with anger. Justice had not arrived, and the absence of it felt heavier than ever. Investigators attended quietly, standing at the back. They had learned not to expect gratitude. Closure is a word used by people who have never had to define it. In reality, there is only resolution, and even that is partial. In the weeks that followed, the case was officially marked inactive. Not unsolved, not prosecuted, but resolved to the extent possible. A phrase carefully chosen. It satisfied no one completely. It wasn't meant to. The final press briefing was brief. Authorities confirmed that the disappearance was the result of a domestic incident, followed by deliberate concealment. They acknowledged that charges were unlikely. They expressed sympathy. They thanked the public. Then they stepped away from the microphones. The silence afterward felt different, heavier, permanent. At the roadside, the marker remained. Wind moved dust across the asphalt. Cars passed without slowing now. Life resumed its ordinary pace, indifferent as ever. But the story had changed. It was no longer a mystery in the wilderness. It was a lesson in proximity. Evil does not always arrive from outside. Sometimes it lives close enough to touch. The desert, once blamed for swallowing the truth, was quietly absolved. It had only held what it was given. The rest had been carried by people year after year, protected by fear and routine. And in the end, that was the most unsettling revelation of all. Because cold cases are not just about what we don't know. They are about what we choose not to say. Once a case is declared inactive, the machinery stops moving, but the consequences do not. Files are shelved. Emails slow. Detectives return to newer crimes with fresher blood and clearer edges. Yet this case lingered not in procedure but in people. It followed them home. It sat in empty rooms. It surfaced in moments of quiet when there was nothing left to distract from it. The family stopped pretending things would go back to normal. There was no normal to return to. Gatherings became rare. When they happened, conversation stayed shallow, rigidly controlled. No one mentioned the past directly, but it pressed in from every side, filling pauses, tightening smiles. Everyone knew what topics to avoid. Everyone knew why. One relative began writing things down. Not a confession. Not a journal meant for anyone else. Just fragments, dates, thoughts, guilt disguised as record-keeping. They never turned it in. They never planned to. It was a way to keep the truth contained, to hold it without releasing it. Investigators would never see it, but the act itself mattered, because even decades later, the need to tell the story had not disappeared. It had only changed form. The sister noticed the shift immediately. People who once met her eyes now looked away. Some apologized awkwardly. Others avoided her entirely. She realized then that the truth, once known, creates new silences. Not everyone wants to stand next to it. Not everyone wants to acknowledge what proximity implies. She stopped attending public events. Not out of shame, but exhaustion. The questions had changed. They were no longer about what happened. They were about how she felt. As if emotion could substitute for accountability. As if her grief could be used to close the book. She refused. In private, investigators struggled with their own version of the aftermath. Cold case detectives are trained to accept limits. But this one pressed harder than most. They knew who had been involved. They understood the sequence. They could see the decision points clearly. And yet the law remained out of reach. Justice, in its formal sense, had slipped away sometime between 1992 and the present. One detective retired shortly after the case was closed internally. On his last day, he removed a photocopy of the roadside photograph from his desk drawer. He had kept it there for years, not as a reminder of failure, but of restraint. Proof that not all truths arrive in time to matter legally, even when they matter morally. Public debate flared briefly, then faded. Social media moved on. New cases replaced old outrage. Attention is the shortest-lived resource in justice. What remains is memory, and memory is unevenly distributed. The children carried it differently. One began speaking publicly, framing the story not as scandal, but as warning. About silence. About family loyalty misused as a shield. About how easy it is to mistake containment for care. Their voice was steady, deliberate, stripped of drama. It unsettled people more than anger ever could. Another refused all contact, changed phone numbers, declined interviews, moved across state lines. They chose distance as survival. Not everyone heals by confronting the truth. Some heal by narrowing the world until it becomes manageable again. The third stayed close to home. Too close, some thought. They drove past the desert road often, stopping sometimes, standing where the car had been found. They said nothing. They needed no audience. The place itself was enough. The desert remained unchanged. It does not respond to resolution. It does not acknowledge closure. It absorbs and endures. Wind erased footprints within minutes. Sun bleached memory into abstraction. Whatever had once been placed there was now indistinguishable from everything else the land had taken. And yet, the case had altered the way people saw it. The desert was no longer the villain. It was the witness that never spoke. The blame shifted inward, where it had always belonged. Years from now, the headline will still circulate. It will appear in lists of infamous cold cases. Comment sections will argue over semantics. Was it really solved? Was justice served? Outsiders will debate it as an intellectual exercise, detached from the lives it reshaped. But those who lived inside it know the answer is not binary. The case did not end. Calcified. It became a fixed point around which everything else rearranged itself. Careers, relationships, identities. The past did not release its grip. It simply changed how it held on. And that is the final cruelty of unresolved truth. It does not explode once and disappear. It detonates slowly, over decades, fragmenting lives in ways that are quiet, persistent, and irreversible. As night fell again over Arizona, the road lay empty. No marker lights, no sirens, just asphalt cooling under open sky. Somewhere, in houses scattered across the state, people lay awake thinking about a decision made long ago, still echoing, still unfinished. Cold cases never really go cold. They just wait for time to decide how much truth the world can handle. Time passed, but it did not soften the edges. It sharpened them. With every year that slipped by, the absence became more defined, less abstract. What had once been called tragedy was now openly named as choice. And that distinction mattered. Because accidents invite sympathy. Choices invite judgment. Inside the family, the weight of knowing began to separate people along invisible lines. Some clung to the old logic that what was done had been necessary, that exposing it sooner would have destroyed everyone. Others began to see that logic as the final lie, the one that made all the others possible. Arguments flared without warning. A comment at dinner. A tone. A word like protect or survive used too casually. The past was no longer buried. It was sitting at the table. One relative finally asked the question no one had dared to voice out loud. If we loved her, why was she the one who disappeared? No one answered, because every justification collapsed under that weight. Love does not erase a body. Love does not manufacture silence. Love does not train children how not to ask questions. The question lingered long after the room emptied. Investigators, though officially finished, continued to receive calls. Not tips. Confessions without legal consequence. People unburdening themselves to someone they believed could absorb the truth without judgment. Detectives listened, documented what they could, and filed it away. The case had become a repository for regret. One call came late at night, a voice older than expected. Fragile. They didn't give their name. They didn't ask for immunity. They simply said they were tired. Tired of carrying a moment that never let them sleep. They described standing in the desert years ago, watching headlights disappear, realizing that nothing would ever be normal again. The call ended abruptly. There was no follow-up, no trace, but the detail they shared matched something only those involved would know. Another piece clicked into place even if it changed nothing legally. The sister learned about the call weeks later. It didn't comfort her. It confirmed what she already understood, that remorse, delayed long enough, becomes self-serving. It soothes the one who confesses, not the one who lost. She redirected her anger into something quieter, purposeful. She worked with advocacy groups pushing for reforms in missing person investigations, especially cases dismissed early due to lack of evidence. She spoke about how easily a narrative forms when authorities assume the wilderness is explanation enough. Her voice carried weight now, not because of outrage but endurance. The story continued to ripple outward. Journalists revisited similar cases across the Southwest. Patterns emerged. Disappearances attributed to terrain, exposure, chance, later revealed to be domestic, internal, managed. The desert, long blamed as predator, was recast as cover. A place where responsibility could be offloaded and forgotten. The public response shifted again. Less sensational, more uneasy. People began to look inward, not outward. Cold cases stopped feeling distant. They felt uncomfortably familiar. Inside the family, one member cut contact entirely. Not out of denial, but refusal. They refused to participate in a shared lie retroactively reframed as tragedy. They left behind photos, letters, anything that tied them to the old version of events. Starting over felt cleaner than rewriting memory. Another stayed, burdened by loyalty they could not shed. They visited the desert alone, standing where they believed it had happened, trying to imagine a different ending. What if someone had called for help? What if fear had been ignored? What if truth had mattered more than reputation? What if is the most corrosive question of all. As years stacked quietly on top of each other, the case settled into its final form. Not a legal precedent, not a solved crime, but a lesson written in the negative space between facts. A reminder that the most effective concealment is not distance, but agreement. Agreement to stay silent. Agreement to move on. Agreement to let time do what truth should have done immediately. The desert still holds no answers. It never claimed to. The answers were always elsewhere, in living rooms, in whispered conversations, in decisions framed as protection. The land was merely the stage where the final act played out. One evening, long after the headlines had faded, a new marker appeared near the roadside. Not official, no seal, just a small plaque placed quietly, without permission. It bore her name. No dates, no cause, just acknowledgement. It stayed. No one removed it. And that, in its own way, was justice of a different kind. Not punishment, not closure, recognition, a refusal to let the story remain abstract. Cold cases survive because people allow them to, and sometimes they end not with arrests, but with the courage to name what everyone once agreed to hide. As night settled again over Arizona, the wind moved across the sand, indifferent as ever. But somewhere between the silence and the stars, the truth, finally spoken, refused to disappear again. Recognition changes the atmosphere of a place. After the plaque appeared, something subtle shifted along that stretch of road. People slowed again, not out of fear this time, but awareness. The disappearance had been unnamed for so long that giving it a marker felt almost radical. Turned absence into presence. It reminded everyone that something human had ended there, even if the land refused to show it. No one claimed responsibility for placing it. Authorities noticed, debated removal, then decided against it. There was no statute against memory, no regulation governing grief. Leaving it felt like the least intrusive choice. In a case defined by restraint and delay, inaction suddenly felt appropriate. The family noticed, too. Reactions were divided. Some were furious. They saw it as provocation, as a reopening of wounds that had barely scarred over. Others felt relief, a strange, uncomfortable relief, as if the truth, once acknowledged publicly, loosened its grip just enough to breathe. One relative visited the marker late at night. No one knew. They stood there for a long time, reading the name over and over, as if repetition might unlock something final. They did not cry. They did not speak. They left without touching it. Some boundaries remain even in private. The cold case unit archived its last supplemental notes around the same time. These were not official findings, just observations, the kind investigators write for themselves. Patterns of silence, behavioral consistencies, the way families close ranks under pressure. The way fear masquerades as loyalty. One note stood out. This case demonstrates how disappearance can be manufactured without distance, how time can be weaponized, and how truth does not decay at the same rate as evidence. It was not meant for court. It was meant as warning. Elsewhere, the children continued to navigate a world that had suddenly rewritten their origin story. Friends asked careful questions. Strangers asked careless ones. They learned how to deflect, how to set boundaries, how to say it's complicated without sounding evasive. Complexity became their shield. One of them returned to the house where it had happened. Not the desert, the house. It had been remodeled. New paint, new owners, the layout mostly unchanged. They stood in the living room, imagining the argument investigators had described, trying to place voices where furniture now stood. Felt unreal. Domestic spaces are not designed to hold endings. They are designed to absorb them quietly. The new owners had no idea. That too felt intentional. Some stories are never attached to addresses. They drift. They detach. They survive only where people remember them. The sister continued her work. She spoke less about the specifics of the case and more about its mechanics. How missing persons investigations stall. How early assumptions harden into conclusions. How wilderness, poverty, and family reputation can derail urgency. Her message resonated beyond Arizona. She received emails from strangers carrying versions of the same story. Disappearances explained away. Questions discouraged. Silence normalized. The ripple widened. The case began appearing in academic discussions, criminology classes, ethics seminars. It was cited not for its violence, but for its longevity. A case study in how crimes persist without motion, how they survive on agreement rather than force. Meanwhile, within the family, the final illusion collapsed, the idea that time would eventually absolve them. Exposure, even without prosecution, had consequences. Relationships outside the family strained. Invitations stopped coming. Trust eroded. People began to see them not as tragic figures, but as participants in something unresolved. They felt watched, though no one was watching anymore. Guilt has a way of inventing surveillance. One relative considered going public. Fully. Names, details, the entire story. Not for justice, but relief. They imagined what it would feel like to stop carrying it. They imagined the backlash, the legal risk, the permanent damage. In the end, they stayed silent. Habit proved stronger than intention. Silence had become muscle memory. As years accumulated, the case settled into its final cultural form. Not myth, not scandal, something quieter, more unsettling. A reminder that disappearance is not always mystery. Sometimes it is management. Sometimes it is maintenance. The desert continued to host tourists, hikers, photographers chasing sunsets. They passed the marker, some noticing, some not. None understood fully, and they didn't need to. The truth does not require universal recognition to exist. One evening, a storm rolled through. Rare rain, the kind that briefly reshapes the land. Water pooled along the roadside, washing dust away from the plaque. For a moment, it gleamed under passing headlights. Then the rain stopped. The desert returned to itself. Nothing surfaced, nothing resolved, but something endured. The case no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered, not as anomaly, not as tragedy, but as consequence. And that, perhaps, was the only ending it was ever going to allow. Memory has a second life. It moves after the noise fades, after the cameras leave, after the case becomes a reference instead of a headline. In this one, memory settled unevenly. Some people carried it like a burden. Others carried it like a warning. And a few tried, unsuccessfully, to drop it altogether. The plaque remained untouched through seasons. Sun cracked its surface slightly. Dust softened the lettering. Someone occasionally left flowers, though no one ever saw who. It became part of the landscape in the quiet way unresolved things often do. Not celebrated, not hidden, simply present. The family learned to live under a new kind of exposure. Not public scrutiny, but internal reckoning. The kind that surfaces in private moments, when someone laughs too easily, when a memory feels incomplete, when silence stretches too long. Guilt does not announce itself. It seeps. One relative developed health problems. Stress, doctors said. Nothing specific. Everything cumulative. Another became obsessive about routine, about control, about keeping life predictable. Trauma expresses itself in order as often as chaos. The body remembers even when the law does not. The sister received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence written in careful handwriting. I'm sorry for what we let happen. No signature. No explanation. No follow-up. It did not name names. It did not ask forgiveness. It offered nothing except acknowledgement. She kept it, not as evidence, as confirmation. Investigators would never see the letter. It was not meant for them. It was meant to lighten the sender's load. But even that carried weight, because apology without accountability is still a form of self-preservation. The children reached different conclusions about the word justice. One argued that justice had failed completely. Another believed that exposure itself was a kind of reckoning. The third stopped using the word altogether. Language, they learned, can limit understanding as much as it clarifies it. The case continued to influence policy discussions quietly. It was cited in arguments for earlier evidence preservation, for revisiting cases dismissed too quickly, for recognizing domestic concealment as a distinct investigative category. Change came slowly, if at all. Institutions move cautiously when confronted with their own blind spots. Still, something had shifted. Police departments began training officers to question assumptions in missing person cases involving wilderness. Not to accept terrain as explanation without contradiction. Not to let environment replace inquiry. The desert had taught a lesson not about danger but about deflection. Within the family, one last confrontation took place. Not dramatic. No shouting. Just two people sitting across from each other, older now, exhausted. One admitted they had known sooner than they let on. The other admitted they had suspected, but chosen comfort over conflict. There was no resolution, only clarity. They did not speak again after that. As the years pressed on, the case slipped further from public consciousness. New tragedies claimed attention. New mysteries replaced old ones. This was how it had always been. But disappearance leaves residue. It changes the way people think about safety, about family, about what they owe each other. The desert, unchanged, continued to be blamed for other vanishing stories. And each time, someone somewhere remembered this one. Remembered that emptiness can be staged. That silence can be engineered. One evening, a journalist revisited the case for an anniversary piece. They stood by the roadside, recorder off, listening. There was nothing to hear. No ghosts, no answers, just wind and passing cars. They realized then that the story was never in the place. It was in the delay. In the years spent pretending nothing could be done. The article was published quietly. No sensation, no outrage, just facts arranged carefully. It ended with a line that felt almost understated. Some truths arrive too late to prosecute, but never too late to indict the silence that protected them. The sister read it and nodded. It said what she no longer needed to. The family moved on in the only way they could. Not together, not fully apart, but fragmented. The shared secret that once bound them had lost its purpose. Without it, there was little left to hold. And that may have been the final consequence. Not punishment, not absolution, disintegration. Cold cases often end with answers that satisfy no one. This one ended with something more unsettling. Understanding without remedy. Knowledge without release. As Arizona stretched out beneath another vast night sky, the road lay quiet. The plaque caught a brief reflection from a passing car, then vanished again into darkness. The truth remained. Not loud, not dramatic, just impossible to bury anymore. By the time 3 decades had fully passed, the case no longer felt like an event. Felt like a condition, something woven into the background of lives that had learned how to function around it. The shock was gone. What remained was a low, persistent pressure, the kind that changes posture without ever announcing itself. The legal system had finished with the case, but the moral accounting had not. It never does. Courts deal in thresholds and definitions. Conscience does not. Conscience keeps its own records, far less forgiving, far less organized. One of the investigators revisited the file late one evening, long after retirement. Not out of duty, out of habit. He read it slowly this time, not looking for errors, not searching for overlooked leads. Just reading. When he reached the final summary, he realized something unsettling. The case had taught him more about people than any solved homicide ever had. Violence had been brief. Silence had been lifelong. He closed the file and did not open it again. In the family, the oldest members began to pass away. With each death, the possibility of a full confession narrowed further. Not because the truth was disappearing, but because responsibility was. Time does not erase guilt. It redistributes it, thinning it until it no longer lands anywhere cleanly. Funerals were small, carefully managed. Eulogies avoided the past entirely, as if omission itself were an act of respect. No one mentioned the name that still hovered, unspoken, at the edge of every gathering. Absence had become tradition. The sister attended none of them. She had reached a point beyond anger, beyond expectation. Her work now focused on prevention, not redress. She spoke to new investigators, to trainees, to anyone willing to listen, about the danger of narratives that form too quickly. About how easy it is to mistake cooperation for honesty, composure for innocence, family unity for truth. She never named names. She didn't need to. The children marked the anniversary privately. No posts, no interviews. One lit a candle. Another took a long drive through the desert, not stopping, just moving. The third did nothing at all. Survival expresses itself differently in each person. The plaque still stood. It had become weathered enough that it no longer drew attention. Drivers passed without slowing. New residents didn't notice it. This too felt right. Memory does not need spectacle. It needs continuity. At some point, someone spray-painted over it. A name crossed out. No message. Just erasure. The act was discovered the next morning. By evening, the paint had been scrubbed away. No report filed. No investigation opened. The response was immediate and collective, though no one took credit. Silence, for once, worked in service of remembrance. A final internal memo circulated quietly within the department years later. It recommended changes to how missing person cases involving family members were categorized and reviewed. It cited this case without embellishment. No emotion, just outcome. A blueprint drawn from failure. Change came slowly, but it came. And that may have been the only tangible legacy justice could claim. The desert continued to exist without meaning. People assigned it meaning anyway. They always do. But those closest to the case understood now that geography had been incidental. The real distance had been emotional. The real concealment had been social. As time stretched forward, fewer people remembered the headline exactly. The words blurred. The year faded. But the idea remained, that a disappearance could be solved without anyone being saved, without anyone being punished, without anyone being made whole again. That idea lingered, uncomfortable and unresolved. On a quiet night, the sister drove past the road one last time. She did not stop. She did not look away either. She had spent years holding space for a truth no one wanted. She no longer needed to stand guard over it. The truth was out now. It would survive without her. And somewhere, deep beneath the routines of ordinary life, the consequences continued their slow work. Invisible, irreversible, complete. One part remained. Not a revelation. Not a confession. Just the aftermath waiting to be named. The aftermath does not announce itself. It settles. Quietly. Permanently. Long after the last article is archived and the last interview forgotten, it lives on in the smallest adjustments people make without realizing why. Pause before answering. A glance held too long. A habit formed around avoiding certain truths. This was the final shape of the case. Not a crime in progress, not a mystery unfolding, but a presence that refused to disappear even after it had been named. Years from now, someone will drive that road and never know what happened there. They will see only desert and sky, the endless horizon promising nothing and taking nothing back. That is how most stories end, not with understanding but with distance. And yet distance is not erasure. The land does not forget what it has been asked to carry. Inside the family, the last unspoken rule finally dissolved. No more pretending the subject was off limits. No more shared silence disguised as peace. People stopped meeting altogether. It was easier that way. Without the secret to bind them, there was nothing left to hold. That too was a consequence. One relative, nearing the end of their life, spoke the truth out loud for the first time. Not to police, not to media, to no one who could record it. Just to an empty room. They said her name. They said what happened. They said they were sorry. Changed nothing. But it changed them. Confession, even unheard, has a cost. The sister learned of it later through a third party. She did not respond. There was nothing left to exchange. Forgiveness requires presence. Accountability requires timing. Both had passed. The children carried forward in separate directions. None of them spoke of closure. They spoke of acceptance. A quieter word. Less dramatic. More honest. Acceptance does not heal. It stabilizes. It allows life to continue without pretending the wound was never there. The plaque eventually cracked along one edge. Whether time, indifference. Someone repaired it with epoxy carefully, almost tenderly. Again, no one claimed responsibility. Care had become anonymous. That felt right. The case entered the quiet category of truths that exist without resolution. It would be referenced occasionally, cited carefully, remembered unevenly. But it would never again be a question mark. That alone was enough to change its gravity. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time. This one was not frozen. It was preserved, intact, unresolved, and fully understood. A difference that matters more than it seems. Because understanding does not undo harm. But it prevents repetition. Somewhere, a new investigator reads about it during training. They underline a sentence. They remember it years later when faced with a similar disappearance. They hesitate before assuming. They ask one more question. They look closer at the family instead of the landscape. That is how legacy works when justice cannot. As the desert stretches endlessly beneath the sky, it holds no verdict. It never did. Verdicts belong to people, and people finally have named what they once hid. The story does not end with an arrest. It does not end with a body. It does not end at all. It becomes part of the cautionary fabric, a reminder whispered beneath every missing person report, every uneasy silence, every explanation that arrives too neatly. This is what happens when truth is delayed. This is what remains when silence is chosen. And somewhere, beyond the reach of headlines and law, the echo of that decision continues. Not loud, not dramatic, but permanent. The cold case is solved. The damage is not. And that is the last thing the desert will ever need to know. The story does not stop just because the voice does. Silence is not an ending. It is a condition that continues to operate long after the last word fades. And in this case, silence was never empty. It was active. It was deliberate. It was the final mechanism that allowed everything else to survive. Years later, when the case is mentioned less often, when the plaque blends almost completely into the landscape, when the name no longer triggers immediate recognition, the damage continues its quiet work. It shows up in ways no headline ever could. In the way people hesitate before trusting family narratives that sound too clean. In the way investigators pause before closing a file too early. In the way absence is treated not as mystery, but as signal. Someone new joins the police department. Young, confident. They study cold cases late at night, learning the language of failure and delay. They read about this one. They note how long it took, how many people knew, how little anyone said. It unsettles them. Not because of the violence, but because of the coordination. because it proves that truth does not always need force to disappear. Sometimes it only needs agreement. The desert continues to host stories, some real, some imagined, some never resolved. But this one has altered the lens through which those stories are told. The wilderness is no longer accepted as explanation. It is questioned, pressed, challenged. The land has been stripped of its convenient role as culprit. And that shift matters. Within the family, what remains is not guilt alone. It is distortion. Birthdays remembered incorrectly. Stories that no longer align. Memory corrupted by years of rehearsal. People begin to doubt not just what they did, but what they remember. This is the final cost of prolonged silence. It eats inward, dissolving certainty itself. One relative dreams of her sometimes, not as she was at the end, but as she was before everything tightened, laughing, distracted, alive in ways that do not survive narrative. They wake with the same thought every time, that the version of her they remember most clearly is the one that had to disappear for everything else to remain intact. That realization never leaves. The sister's work slows eventually, not because the mission is complete, but because the body carries its own limits. She steps back quietly. No farewell. No announcement. Others take up the cause. Her absence from the conversation is noted, then accepted. She has given enough. The children build lives that do not revolve around the case, but are shaped by it nonetheless. They choose partners carefully. They ask different questions. They understand, perhaps better than most, how easily love can be used as justification. How protection can become erasure. They do not speak often of what happened. They do not need to. The knowledge is integrated now. Not healed. Integrated. Occasionally, someone still asks the wrong question. Do you feel closure now? The answer is always the same. No explanation. Just a look. Because closure implies symmetry. An ending that matches the beginning. This story never offered that. It began with disappearance and ended with exposure. Those are not equal things. The plaque remains. Weathered. Ordinary. Almost invisible. And that is its power. It does not demand attention. It waits. For the rare person who stops. For the one who reads the name slowly. For the moment when curiosity turns into understanding. Nothing else is required. Cold cases are often measured by outcomes. Arrests, convictions, sentences. This one will never offer those metrics. Its resolution exists elsewhere, in altered behavior, in institutional caution, in private reckonings that never make it to record. It exists in the fact that the truth, once delayed, still managed to surface. Incomplete, imperfect, but undeniable. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all. Because it means silence is powerful, but not permanent. It means time can protect lies, but it can also exhaust them. It means some stories end not with justice, but with understanding sharp enough to prevent repetition. The desert does not care. The law has limits. Families fracture. But truth, even late, even damaged, even costly, has a way of refusing to stay buried forever. This case was never about where she went. It was about who stayed quiet. And now, with nothing left to uncover and nothing left to say, the silence finally belongs to the past. No longer a shield, no longer a weapon, just the echo of a choice made once and carried for a lifetime. The cold case is solved. The story remains. Time moves on without ceremony. It always does. Long after the case slips from public memory, long after the final article is archived and the last interview aired, the consequences continue to unfold in private spaces where no microphone ever reaches. Kitchens, bedrooms, hospital rooms, places where truth doesn't announce itself, it simply sits and waits. There are moments, quiet and unplanned, when the past resurfaces without warning. A name spoken by a stranger, a date circled on a calendar, a photograph found in a drawer that was supposed to be empty. These moments do not arrive with drama. They arrive with weight. And those who feel it know immediately what it belongs to. The investigators who touch the case carry it forward, whether they admit it or not. They reference it in meetings without naming it. They hesitate when a family seems too united, when a story aligns too perfectly, when grief looks rehearsed. This case recalibrated their instincts. It taught them that loyalty can be louder than fear, that time can be weaponized, that truth does not always break under pressure. It erodes under patience. In the community, the shock never fully disappears. It settles instead, becoming part of the town's internal geography. People remember where they were when they first heard the story was reopened. They remember the disbelief, the denial, the slow, sickening realization that the danger had never come from outside, never passed through town limits, never left footprints in the sand. It had lived among them. New families move in. They don't know the history at first. They sense something, though. A pause when certain names are mentioned. A subtle redirection of conversation. The way older residents fall quiet at specific intersections, specific stretches of road. The past leaves traces even when it's not explained. Someone eventually tells them, not all at once, in fragments, carefully edited. And even then, the story sounds unreal. Too contained, too domestic, too close. That is the most unsettling part. Because monsters are easier to understand when they look like monsters. This one never did. Within the family, time fractures relationships further. Some stop speaking entirely. Others maintain contact through rituals stripped of warmth. Holidays observed out of obligation. Conversations kept shallow to avoid collapse. The truth didn't free them. It rearranged them into shapes that barely hold. One member, older now, admits something years later. Not to police, not to press, but to a stranger who will never repeat it. They say the hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was watching everyone pretend it wasn't heavy. Carrying something that massive in plain sight and being expected to act normal under its weight. They say silence becomes instinct, reflex, survival. And once learned, it never fully goes away. The sister, distant now from the case, still feels it in her body. A tightening in the chest when she hears similar stories. A sharp clarity when she recognizes the early signs of erasure in other investigations. She never sought revenge. She sought accuracy. She wanted the story to stop lying. In that, she succeeded. But accuracy has its own cost. It strips away comforting versions of events. It leaves nothing to lean on. It replaces myth with mechanics, and mechanics are cold. Still, she would choose it again. The children grow older. They ask fewer questions. Not because they don't care, but because they understand the answers now. They know that knowing everything does not guarantee peace. They build their lives with intention, aware of how easily reality can be rewritten when no one is watching closely enough. They become careful witnesses. And that may be the quiet legacy of this case. Not justice, not punishment, but awareness. An understanding that truth can be delayed, distorted, buried beneath love and loyalty and fear, but never fully erased. It waits, patient, persistent, uninterested in comfort. The desert remains unchanged. Wind, heat, distance. But it no longer carries the blame. The story has moved where it belongs, into human hands, human choices, human failures. Cold cases often end with answers. This one ended with exposure. And exposure is irreversible. Because once the illusion breaks, it cannot be rebuilt. The story cannot be told the old way again. The silence cannot reclaim its authority. The lie has lost its structure. What remains is something quieter, heavier, truer. A reminder that time does not heal everything. It reveals. And long after the final word is spoken, long after the voice fades from the room, the truth continues to do what it has always done best. It stays.